last week I watched the HBO miniseries Chernobyl, which I think a lot of other people were watching and talking about as well. And I think it has some interesting lessons on the issue of energy. But I just want to start with saying that I think its core theme was profoundly true. And then the quality of the storytelling in displaying that theme was incredibly good. I mean, I went through it in 2 days and I would have gone through it one day, except for I value my sleep. But the basic theme is really the impact of dishonesty on society. And like if you're concerned with human flourishing, then you're deeply concerned with the truth because you want to know the full impact of your different potential choices on human life. But if you're looking at a dictatorship, and of course, Chernobyl was a nuclear accident that took place in the Soviet Union in the 80s, dictatorships are not geared towards human flourishing, to say the least. That what they're really centered on is they're geared towards power and prestige of the rulers. And when that is your orientation, you're not thinking, well, what's the best way to achieve power and prestige? It's the facts and the truth are actually threats to this false image of superiority and the desire to rule people that you have. And so, in the context of this story, there's this fundamental lie that the Soviets are advanced technologically. But the truth is that they're incredibly primitive. And so they have these nuclear reactors that are so poorly designed that even they know, even though but will not communicate to the people in the industry and to other scientists that these nuclear reactors are capable of a massive disaster. And they're just covering that up because that would harm the truth, would harm Soviet prestige. And then in order to protect that lie, you add layer upon layer of further lies, such as not admitting the extent of the damage or danger once that disaster actually happens. And so here's just a few quotes that are expressing the theme that, I mean, are just, as standalone quotes, are awesome. So the truth doesn't care about our needs or wants. It doesn't care about our governments, our ideologies, our religions. It will lie in wait for all time. And this, at last, is the gift of Chernobyl. Then another one is, when the truth offends, we lie and lie until we can no longer remember it is even there, but it is still there. And then there's where I once would fear the cost of truth. Now I only ask, what is the cost of lies? And then a line that I really wish I had written because it's just perfect and profound. Every lie we tell incurs a debt to the truth. Sooner or later, that debt is paid. So I think, like, as a movie expressing a deep moral lesson, it was excellent. But there's also the issue that the reaction to the series has involved quite a bit of fear, evoking fear of nuclear and of radiation in particular, and in reinforcing this fear of nuclear power, which, to the credit of the filmmakers, at least by their own statements, that was not their goal. And if you watch the movie, it's very clear that the kind of disaster that happened at Chernobyl was based on a design flaws that just like it could not happen in the West, let alone like a modern nuclear power plant. But I mean, as they display it in the movie, one thing that it comes across is that radiation is, I mean, it's in effect like if you took, like, supercharged, superpowered Ebola and just were shooting it through the air. Like, it is, it spreads from person to person. It, like, is gonna, melt your face if you live miles away. It's portrayed as incredibly, incredibly scary, and the reaction from a lot of people is, "Oh my gosh, there's a nuclear power plant near me. We have to, put an end to this. This is really scary." Um, Stefan, why don't you share sort of your take on the facts about nuclear and radiation versus the kind of mythology that unfortunately Chernobyl helps propagate?
Yeah, so I haven't seen the series myself, so I don't I cannot comment on the exact details, but from what I've heard is that sort of people were sort of expecting that people who get radiation poisoning on site in Chernobyl were essentially dead and the clock was ticking for them. So, and that reminds me of a little anecdote that I listened to on a different podcast some years ago, and it was about scientists and engineers working at Oak Ridge Laboratory, like in the 1950s and 60s, and sort of developing early laboratory versions of nuclear reactors. And so they would then have sort of accidents and spill themselves with contaminated water and so on, something that would never happen in a commercial reactor. These are like frontier scientists experimenting with something dangerous like Marie Curie, with their radioactive chemicals and tasting it and something like that. And these people would then radiation poisoning themselves, losing hair and getting red colored skin and so on. And all of them went on to have pretty long, healthy lives after that. So they recovered from that. And so even in an event like a serious accident where people really get hurt with radiation and have immediate effects, and this acute radiation syndrome is really serious and can kill you if you get too much radiation at one single time. But if you recover from it, there's a good chance that you will, survive and not even have necessarily long-term consequences. So it's, of course, in the movies it's dramatized, pushed over the edge in some cases. But there's radiation has some advantages over other potential threats, I think. So when you think about toxins, in the air or in the water or something, you never know where they are. It's very difficult to test for them, to be aware of where's a hotspot, where it's actually dangerous. So if you think about an incident like Fukushima, at Fukushima, people were very aware of, where the radiation was going, where hotspots built up and so on. And you could avoid something like, oh, this is getting close to a dangerous level that we want to avoid. So they just, had this hotspot marked and didn't let anyone go near that. On the other hand, what's a tsunami in Fukushima who caused this nuclear accident washed out some chemical plant, maybe I don't know, solar manufacturing plant, and all these chemicals that might be carcinogens or have a different toxic effect. Nobody cares about like who got exposed to what. Where's a hotspot of that material, right? So, and this in many cases can be much more dangerous, but radiation you can actually measure and avoid. And I think part of the tragic thing that happened at Chernobyl, besides the reactor design that was not appreciating individual human life, just like the Soviet system didn't, and the bad management afterwards, a big part of that was just that the cover up made things worse than they needed to be. So one of the big consequences of that was thyroid cancers in the general population from radiating iodine that they ingested. And this is a cancer that you can, survive. I think it has something about a 1% death rate if properly screened for and so on. And so the Soviets didn't just screw up the nuclear reactor. The cover up actually, it's not just the lie that they were not technologically superior. It's just this cover up risked more human lives than it needed to. And this is, this is a system failure. It's not so much that the nuclear accident in itself was actually sort of more benign than something else going wrong could have been. You know, so I think that the death toll recently from the UN body estimating that, I think they systematically put that downwards from something like over 20,000 to then 4,000, and now they have like less than 100 direct death, and then maybe something like 5,000 thyroid cancer cases. And it's possible that very few other effects, if any, happened. other than psychological effects and, of course, economic effects long term. So, radiation and nuclear technology in itself, like even in a disaster where many things go wrong and many things were badly designed, the nuclear accident is actually one of the more benign things to happen.
Yeah, so it's just this whole focus on the truth, which is what I like about the documentary. Um, like as I mentioned, it's the truth is valuable if you actually have a goal that depends upon the truth. That is, if you care about human life, then you need to know how do you sustain yourself in reality, and that includes knowing what's true about different energy sources, and that means looking at the positives and the negatives and comparing them to the alternatives. So, I mean, one of the things, like even in this worst case of a nuclear, uh, disaster, people still had time to react, and the Soviets, as inept as they were, had the time to try to take mitigating actions, and it was very different than if a dam breaks or if a refinery explodes or something like that. And so the it really should strengthen, I think, the case for nuclear. But part of what we we've stressed at the Center for Industrial Progress is the way in which the Greens are not focused on human flourishing. That is, that their goal is essentially negative. It's essentially opposing human flourishing. It's not for anything positive. And if your goal is negative, if your goal is to tear something down, if your goal is to oppose industry and capitalism and human life, then you're actually not, you have no motive to be interested in the truth, because you can throw out things in a biased and sloppy way in order to serve that goal, because you're not actually trying to build something. You're not trying to achieve something positive, in which case the lesson of the show Chernobyl, which is a true lesson, is that truth matters.